Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlow, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome to Strength Chat. This is the mad scientist of powerlifting, Chris Duffin here. To my right, we've got our mature athlete and coach, Rudy Cadlow. And to my left, we've got the wizard of training, Brandon Sen. Today, really excited to have Quinn Henoch on. Dr. Quinn Henoch, I should say, physical therapist and founder of The Clinical Athlete. And Quinn does some very similar things to us, and so we're excited to talk to him. He plays around mostly on the weightlifting side of the world, and when we say weightlifting, we're talking about Olympic lifting. But Quinn, welcome to the show.
Chris, Rudy, Brandon, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be on the show.
So I thought we'd start out by introducing people to what you're doing with The Clinical Athlete. I think it's a tremendous resource, and basically our athletes of all discipline, we focus, a lot of our listeners are barbell sport or strength coaches, but it's an incredible resource for people to actually find a practitioner that is also, an athlete themselves. They actually lift weights, and you're not going to hear the answer to that is just quit squatting. Now, that may indeed be the correct answer at times, but shouldn't be the answer that we automatically hear when we walk in as a lifter. Isn't that right, Quinn?
Yeah, so this is an idea I had, probably several years, 5-6 years ago. I didn't have the resources or the wherewithal to put it in motion. But so clinicalathlete.com is a directory of healthcare providers who have a better understanding of exactly what you said, of strength and conditioning, sports performance, and they are athletes themselves. And so, a physical therapist, a chiropractor, massage therapist, medical doctor. These are guys who obviously have the health professional training, but they also have the athletic background this is similar to the athletes that they're treating. And so they just have a better understanding of how to integrate the athlete back into sport. And so you're not going to get that, what you just said, squatting's bad for your knees, deadlifting's bad for your back, this fear-mongering language that we get a lot in healthcare. And so it's a free resource. An athlete can go on the website, clinicalathlete.com. The directory is on every page, and hopefully they've got a provider in their area. I screen every single person that's on the map. And so that's been since day one. We went live on September 1st of last year. So we're about a year old at this point, and every single provider that is on that map I've spoken to on the phone or I've met in person. So there's an application process. There's kind of a pre-screen. We have a forum as well. It's a private forum. It's for the clinicians who are on the map, and so we put those providers in the forum to discuss things with us even before they get listed on the directory. And so there's just a multi-tiered process, and hopefully the athlete is confident that they've been through kind of a vetting process and all the information is there, their athletic background, and they can be confident that professional is going to understand their goals.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendous resource, especially, a lot of us, particularly strength coaches these days, and I'll refer to like Brandon here on my left, there's a lot of people that deal with clients remotely. And it's like, I've got a client in New York or Florida. We have a lot of resources, but not in every area that we know somebody. And the ability to say, hey, this is who you should go see in that area, that's tremendous.
That was a big thing for me. I get the questions all the time. Do you know somebody here? Do you know somebody there? Sometimes the answer is yes. But a lot of times it's no. But now I have this network to kind of fall back on, and I can actually touch base with the provider beforehand. I can shoot their profile page over to the athlete so they can kind of pre-screen. It's been a really great resource for not only the public but also as a professional development hub for us clinicians, because we discuss things back and forth, and I've made some colleagues who now I consider mentors of mine, just through that network. So it's been great.
It's a tremendous resource. And one of the things that I think is of great value there is, you said they're an athlete, and that gives them a different bias or different look that is really important. You've gone through school, you've got your doctorate, you're a practicing therapist. And I deal with a lot of people in our network. I haven't gone through that process myself, but I find a vast difference in, the approach to that, because it seems that a lot of people in the schooling process aren't really introduced to like loaded movement patterns, the value of that, even being aware of like the positioning and stuff that you need to be in. And, that I encounter that bias a lot. And the only people that I really, not the only, but, it definitely sets the tone or the difference when they have that experience to mix with that clinical background.
It's huge. I mean, it's everything, and we touched on this even before the show started. We were kind of talking about physical therapy school. There's so much, and even med school, there's so much information that jam pack into those 3, 4, 7 years, whatever your schooling goes towards. There's so much information there. Sometimes the actual, higher level, top end integration stuff gets thrown by the wayside because it's not as important in the initial stages, right? First of all, a medical practitioner is worried about not killing someone. First and foremost, keep them alive. And then from my perspective as a PT, don't protect the surgery, don't re-injure them, let Mother Nature do their healing. But then how do I actually integrate them back to this high level performance? And that's that very top end that there may not just be enough time. And sometimes the professors don't know that either because they were never taught. And so the providers who understand that stuff, there's twofold. They were either a coach before, during, or after their schooling. Coach being sports performance, sports specific, whatever that may be, or they're actually diving into the literature because it's very, very clear that loading progressions, it is the thing that changes tissue, creates actual, physiological change over time. We know this. Yep. It's very, very clear, but that type of thing is not necessarily jammed into our heads in school because there's just so many other things that we have to know beforehand.
Yeah, there's a reason it's called progressive resistance training. Because you have to continue to load over time. Quinn, for those of you who haven't, or for those of our listeners who haven't met you before, not to regress here, but obviously your passion is in is being a clinician and getting there. But can you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you played football in college and track and field, but tell us a little bit about your sports background. And what drove you? Was there something that happened during the team sports experience or your individual sports experience that led you down the path that you currently are following?
Yeah, I've got a similar story to, I think, a lot of people in the same boat where I was in high school. I played football and I ran track, and then I was lucky enough to play football in college. I actually went to Indiana University for a year in Bloomington, Indiana, so like the Big Ten. Got cut, so it was going to be a walk-on, and a small fish in a big pond there. Even IU, people make jokes about them struggling in the Big Ten, but it's still Big Ten football. And so I transferred to a smaller D1 AA school in Valparaiso, which is about 30 minutes south of Chicago, and played for 3 years there. I was a defensive back, so I was just annoying little gnat running around and chopping people down. But it was in that period that I fell in love with certain aspects of training. The snatch and clean and jerk were always my favorite part, and I was lucky enough to have that stuff in high school and college. I loved just the feeling of the weight room. I almost enjoyed it more. I certainly enjoyed that more than just football practice in and of itself,
Sure.
Being inundated with a bunch of drills, football games, that's a different story, that's where the passion comes. But I think certainly that's where my love of the weight room came into play. And I was dealing with a lot of chronic stuff. I was lucky enough never to have an abrupt, acute injury, but I had a lot of just wear and tear stuff. And I actually saw a physical therapist in undergrad and didn't even realize that's what I was in. I just thought it was as an athletic trainer or whatever it was, you're just giving me exercises. It ended up being a licensed PT when I think back on it. But I actually didn't decide on physical therapy school until after undergrad. So I got my exercise science degree. I played 3 years of college football. I loved it. And I was working as a strength coach in the private sector. Wanted to go university, but the hours, it was just that life just didn't quite appeal to me. So I went private sector at a couple facilities, and could write a program, could coach the lifts. But when somebody was either injured or I saw some tweak in their movement that I thought was a little off, but I didn't quite have that knowledge, and I thought that physical therapy was kind of the perfect bridge, because they seem to tout themselves as, quote unquote movement specialists, whatever that truly means. But, with my background in performance, I thought it would be the perfect bridge. So I decided to go back to PT school and 2010 at the University of Indianapolis, and that was a doctorate of physical therapy program, and graduated in 2013. And at that point, it was when I started PT school that I picked up the sport of weightlifting. So I graduated from, in undergrad in 2009. I missed football. I wanted something athletic. I actually did a couple powerlifting meets. Top end strength was just never my thing. The bench press is just not my thing. I got long arms, and there's
bench
women.
Press doesn't count. Is that in powerlifting?
Really
I don't think it is. I think they got rid of it.
We don't have any good bench pressers over here.
Yeah, take the jerk out of the clean and jerk and weightlifting, and we're good. Nothing that involves my upper body. But I just needed some type of competitive stimulus, and weightlifting was always where it was at for me. Just the speed element, and you don't need to be like super, super, super strong, but you still need some strength, but you integrate it with power, and that was where it was at. So I've competed in the sport of weightlifting for 6 years now exclusively. I don't run in the car if it's raining, type of deal. So super specialized there, and it was around that time that I began PT school. So starting competitive weightlifter, physical therapy student, and that's where I started to try to bridge the two worlds, and I've kind of been doing that since.
So you've developed your clientele and your practice. How did you determine or decide to reach out to the rest of the world? Because you're actually out there now.
I think a lot of it was luck. A lot of it was having the right friends. I mean, honestly, in PT school, I had been working with gyms back home in Louisville, Kentucky. Was actually where I started to practice after PT school, and that's where I got into maybe some of the listeners are familiar with Dark Side Strength, that I was kind of collaborating with a coach named Ryan Brown, who had a mutual connection in Chad Wesley Smith of Juggernaut Training Systems. That's how I met Chad, was through Ryan and Dark Side Strength, and that was in 2010 at some seminar in Kentucky, some strength and conditioning seminar down there. We happened to cross paths, and I think it was around that time that I wrote an article about foam rolling or knees out or something semi-controversial that started to get it shared on the internet, and Chad reached out to me about doing more blogs and more videos and maybe coaching at a seminar here and there. All the while I was starting to put more videos out with Dark Side Strength, and I think it was just kind of the ball was just picking up momentum, and I had just had good friends that were kind enough to share my stuff, and I was starting to get better at weightlifting and actually hitting, national qualifying totals. That was kind of, I guess legitimizing my opinion, even though that shouldn't be the case. But yeah, over the last 2 or 3 years, that's kind of how it turned out.
Excellent.
And you're down in Orange County now, is that right?
I'm in Orange County, California now. Yeah.
Great.
It's nice. It's sunny here. It's good.
Yeah, well, I think we should get into more of the nuts and bolts of really what we want to get out of you today. So one of the big things that I think we wanted to talk to you about today is really your mechanism of developing the athletes coming back from injury, and the specific tools used, and maybe some of the myths that are perpetrated out of the fitness industry right now. You posted Juggernaut posted a video recently with you talking about common mobility implementations and tools and their actual use, and you really got into the research side of it. So in your opinion as a clinician, as well as the research, what is it really saying right now in terms of foam rolling and other soft tissue manual treatments that athletes can do on themselves?
Yeah, totally. It's a big topic. It's a controversial topic a lot of times because people have made entire professions. Their livelihood kind of depends on some of these implements and techniques. But I'll just speak on the evidence and then kind of talk about how we implement it based on that. So when I say mobility implements, I'm referring to foam rollers, lacrosse balls, bands, just the more commonly used things. And then in the clinical world, you can extrapolate that to even just manual therapy techniques, some of the instrument-assisted soft tissue, like a lot of the metal tools that are out there, all of that stuff. So it's all kind of lumped into the same category. What the research currently shows is that stuff is altering the neurophysiological or perceptual input of the brain rather than changing structure at a cellular level. So there's a couple studies. There's one study that on rat models, they used human-sized metal tools. They tore these poor little rat MCLs, and then they put them unconscious, and they treated them with the metal tools. And over the course of weeks, that MCL collagen actually remodeled to more of a normal alignment compared to the control group who didn't receive the same treatment. And so then we extrapolated that to also be able to work on humans. It made perfect sense. Rats have similar connective tissue makeup, and so if we do the same treatment on humans, we'll be able to realign our collagen. It'll actually change structural alignment, break up fascia, scar tissue, that type of thing. What we're actually seeing is that we're actually not able to recreate that as well with human physiology. The amount of force that's required, another study in 2008, way back in 2008, showed that it takes upwards of 2,000 pounds of force to remodel the fascia of the deep thigh, to even just 1% shear in that case. And so what we're seeing is that, let's say I foam roll for 20, I foam my quad or my TFL or something like that for 20 seconds. I get up and I retest my squat, and it feels better. I feel looser, however you define that. What's likely happened is that you haven't changed your structure on a cellular level. What you've done is changed your perception. So the implement has created this very concentrated neurological sensory input, and then the output is that you perceive less tension. It's like if I jam my finger, playing basketball, the ball jams my finger and I intuitively shake it. I'm creating another sensory input to try to supersede the one that I'm trying to get rid of, right? The pain signal. And so that's kind of how we see, and even with the banded mobilizations, these things have been around for decades. Back into the 1950s, guys like Brian Mulligan, Geoffrey Maitland, started with these banded mobilizations as a pain mechanism to decrease the pain mechanism, not necessarily to change structure in the long term. So we use in rehab, we use these implements to create a change in perception to where the athlete now feels less tension, pain, tightness, whatever, what have you, in the same range of motion that was once provocative, 2 minutes ago, and then we load it progressively. And ultimately what we know is that external load over the course of time is what changes structure in the long term. So it's not that we don't use these mobility implements. It's just that we use them in much shorter bouts, maybe 20, 30 seconds, whatever, however long it takes to change your sensory perception, and then we load with some variation. Yeah,
so I think this is an absolutely phenomenal discussion that a lot of people miss, and it aligns with exactly the methodology that we promote and actually some of the explanations that I provided. But just think about it from a stretching perspective. Some of the studies I've read to actually change tissue through stretching means that you have to be in a stretch for 30 minutes or there's no structural change. Yet, if you sit there and stretch for 2 minutes, all of a sudden your mobility increases. Why is that? It's exactly the same thing. And we use a lot of active mobility for very short periods of time with devices to achieve the results. So instead of laying on a foam roller for 5-10 minutes, we do 3 to 4 movements with those pressure points using the tools that we use. But at the same time, we've noticed, and this is where I jumped to actually the same literature that you're using as some sort of pseudo explanation, but I get the question because people use our implements, like our boomstick, pain pill, some of the stuff where you're actually in a relaxed position instead of being on a foam roller, hitting the same tissue, and they'll feel it. They're like, this works way better. Why is that? What's the explanation? What's the study? And I'm like, well, I've got no studies to point to other than I know it works and you notice the difference. But if we think about it, if it's from a neuromuscular signaling standpoint, if you're laying on a roller and you've got tension holding and controlling your body, we're clearly sending a different signal to the brain than if we're in a relaxed standpoint or applying pressure and actually mobilizing that tissue and moving through the movement. So that's the only thing that I can reach to is saying, well, clearly we're sending a different signal, so we're going to get a different response. And that's the explanation of why you're seeing a different response. But we're huge promoters, so this is one of the things I mentioned before the call that I've written a couple articles. One's yet to be released. It'll be out by the time this is. But we believe that all of our exercise prep should be done in under 9 minutes. If you're spending more than 9 minutes, so I call it single minute exercise prep, SMEP. So just to brand it, because I want to beat it up, because people spend 30 to 45 minutes, and even I make fun of Kelly Starrett's followers. I love Kelly, by the way, but so many people with a Supple Leopard book are the ones spending 45 minutes of stretching. And I've got Kelly on camera. We talk about it. He's like, if you're spending more than 10 minutes, you're doing it wrong. And that's the point. You shouldn't be stretching or foam rolling that long, because we're just sending these signals, and we can do it really quick. We can target what we need to do, right? If you've got a proper assessment and know the thing that you need to focus on.
Exactly. It's just, I see it all the time in the gym here.
And then, like you said, get to loading it. That's the next thing we do. So once you do that, apply load. We did this with Rudy recently. He had some significant mobility issues. He was able to raise his hand. He just had before shoulder surgery right here. We opened up his lat and subscap, did some work. He's all the way up here. And what's the first thing I told you to go do, Rudy?
Yeah, load it.
I said, let's go bench.
Let's
right away. We got to do that right now. So.
And so, take a weightlifter who needs to go overhead, same exact scenario, but they have to snatch and clean and jerk up here, right? And so they went from, maybe only moving their shoulder, you did some, whatever it is, foam roll, static stretch your lat, and all of a sudden you get that transient change. However, maybe a split jerk or, a barbell push press is still too advanced of a progression. Well, let's regress to the next most challenging variation and see if you can do that. So can you go behind the neck? Can you just press and split instead of doing a full split jerk? Can't do that? Okay. Well, now we have kettlebells. Can you stand and press a kettlebell? Can you do a landmine press? Before we start giving all the I call them the jack off exercises with the pink TheraBand, let's start at the top and work our way down. And we stop as soon as you are in a variation that you can move through the range of motion comfortably, without pain or apprehension. And then I call that a cluster. So I similar to you, I coined something, but I'm like, you have to have tempo with your warm-up. First of all, it's called a warm-up for a reason. We know for a fact that we're better athletes if our core temperature is higher, our nerve signaling is more accurate, the viscosity of the muscle changes in a more advantageous way for athletics. So you literally have to get warm during your warm-up. And so what I say is move with tempo. If you foam roll this area 20, 30 seconds, here's your loaded, intermediate variation. Go back and forth, boom, boom, boom. Change perception, load, change perception, load. 3 or 4 rounds of that, all of a sudden you're like, wow, I feel way looser. And now you're into your more higher level, training, but you've greased the groove a little bit better than what you said, spending 30 minutes just rolling around, looking at your phone.
Exactly.
Complete waste of time.
It's really frustrating watching people do this stuff. And I was telling you about my workout that I did this morning. It was a lot of weight, a lot of reps, but my warm up, I was doing what I call a shin box get up, and it's just it's an active movement, firing glutes and adductor balance and some other stuff, and but I was having restrictions in my left glute. I didn't start with rolling my glute. I started with the shin box get up, feeling where I'm at. Then I would jump over, do some active mobilization with some of the tools, jump back, and do the shin box deadlift back and forth until I felt good. Then I went into my warm up. It took me maybe 5 to 7 minutes. But I did exactly what you're talking about.
So you used movement to identify the limitation, as opposed to starting just a shotgun. Let me just foam roll, stretch, band, lacrosse ball, head to toe, and just guess and test. Throw shit at the wall and see if something sticks. So you
got to have an assessment, and then you've got it's test retest, right? It's very simple. So yeah.
And that's why, it's not rocket science. You feel, okay, you felt restriction here, stick a ball in there dig in there. It doesn't have to be this precise. You don't have to feel like you're splitting the surfaces of the muscle, the exact TFL versus glute med. It's just not that serious,
But it also comes down to identifying, because a lot of people they watch a video on stretching this and mobilizing that and rolling this, and they just add everything to that. Well, that's got to be great. I must need it. I must da-da-da. And they just have all this stuff that they work through. And do you really need it? I mean, like...
Well, take your shin box exercise, and I saw that video, by the way, and I love that. If you are able to move through that exercise unimpeded, no pain, no apprehension, feel great, I would argue that you've got the mobility to then go squat.
That's exactly what I would do. I wouldn't do anything else. I would use that as a warm-up, and then we'll jump to squatting.
Yep.
Yeah.
However, when you did it, you felt something, a limitation, and so then you address that specific thing. You use the movement that would otherwise give you the prerequisites, or at least be an assessment in and of itself as the prerequisites to be able to squat, but then use that to identify a limitation, whatever. It doesn't have to be a specific, it's general limitation in this general area. You addressed it with an implement, got a transient change, and then you load it. It's perfect.
And sometimes greasing the groove with that movement I may feel a little restriction there, and I'll just keep doing them for a little bit, and then it'll clean itself, and I never have to actually go to using the tool or the implement.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, okay, we're ready. Exactly, it's a warm-up. And then we move to, and you kind of hit on this earlier, but it's the, load. Load is the, and Rudy hit it, but it doesn't matter whether it's mental, emotional, or weight. How we change as human beings is by applying stress, right? And so this is where I see the value. Again, I get back to the clinical athlete. Like, if you take an athlete that's using load and you move them into a remedial pattern, they're getting no value. They're getting no stress response. So you're actually moving them backwards as a clinician, because you're not gonna elicit. It may work for your 60-year-old grandmother or your 30-year-old couch potato.
Easy. I'm not supposed to use the O word around.
I know. I mature. So but you get my point. Like, it may work for them, but it's not going to work for. If I was working with you, Quinn, it wouldn't work. I'd be moving backwards because you've got no stress from our jerk off exercise. Right?
And isn't that the knock on physical therapy or rehab professionals in general, is that everything's too easy. They're given the same simple exercises to everyone. My argument is, if I give somebody a glute bridge, if I give Chris Duffin a glute bridge, it's for a very specific, I'm teaching motor control in that moment, and I'm getting as far away from the glute bridge as fast as humanly possible. If I'm talking about, if you come to me and say, my lower back hurts when I lock out the deadlift, at the top of the deadlift, I feel a pinch in my lower back, and I say, okay, and then I have you do a back bender, and we deem that you are a little sensitive to lumbar extension, which makes sense, right? You're a little sensitive to that lockout position. And then I test your hip extension, and maybe you're lacking a little bit of hip extension range of motion, or maybe you're just, maybe your hip extensors are just a little bit weaker than your lumbar, extensors, and so you rely on the lower back to lock out the deadlift as opposed to the hips complementing the lower back. Regardless, maybe a glute bridge is a teaching tool in that moment where I have you hold that position and squeeze your ass, keep your abs tight, create that 360 degrees of pressure. But then we're back to the deadlift, and I say, right. Okay, you remember your glutes burning in that glute bridge? You remember that feeling of full hip extension? I want you to recreate that now in your deadlift. And maybe we've regressed to a rack pull or something like that to teach the position. But it's not. What it's not is, all right, 3 sets of 10 glute bridges 3 times a day for the next week. Come back and see me. You'll see how that does.
Next month.
It just doesn't do anything.
Yeah, that goes to purpose and intent.
Yep. And we do the same thing with our seminars. We teach a lot of remedial corrective exercises, but a lot of it, there are times for regressions. There's a lot of value in actually teaching some of the positioning and awareness and things that go into it. So there's a place for it. Absolutely.
100%. But I think especially with weightlifters, the snatch and the clean and jerk are a little bit more complex from a movement standpoint. And there's, especially we have half of our gym is a CrossFit gym, and so we've got the guys throwing around 75-pound snatches, but they're fatigued, number one, and number two, they don't actually have the movement patterns down to begin with. And that's where we're running into problems. And it's the same with the weightlifters.
Yep.
And so these remedial positions are super valuable, but they're motor control teaching tools, not necessarily the fix in and of themselves.
Well, it's injury prevention. I mean, learn the movement pattern correctly first before you get hurt.
Yeah, it's kind of common sense, right?
So for the people that are just listening on this audio version, there's a lot of head nodding coming from me over here as Quinn's speaking through this. So
yeah. Well, I think one of the take-homes for our listeners, and that we keep coming back to, is that you need to have a reason to have an intervention in your movement. I think a lot of people associate their squat day with, this very specific quad IT band, and then glute foam roll, and then maybe they'll go do some, ankle dorsiflexion work or whatever. But is there really any need to not just go in and squat if there isn't any known interventions that need to be made?
I think I think that's a great point. And when I talk about assessments and screenings, I say you may not find the problem. The screening and assessment are not great necessarily at identifying the exact problem, but you know what they're maybe a little bit better at is finding out what you don't need to waste your time on. And so what if I test your ankles and you have a surplus of dorsiflexion? You've got all the Gumby ankle range of motion in the world, but yet you spend 10 minutes a day during every squat prep trying to mobilize more when you've got it. You've got plenty of range. And so we can allocate that time to maybe practicing the squat. Novel concept there is putting more time into your training. But that's a great point. I use it like, let's learn what not to waste your time on.
So if we can put that together, is, say, someone comes into the gym, they have a squat training session, is there a certain warm-up hierarchy that you would go to in terms of loading, whether it's going straight to the bar, squatting, finding out you need to make an intervention, or is there known injury history that then we go to and then establish our warm-up that way?
Well, I think it's context dependent. I think the answer is yes to either case, depending on the athlete. If there's injury history, if I'm kind of a bias, my perspective is skewed. Everybody I see has got something going on, when somebody tells me that they're fine, no, I don't hurt, everything's great. I'm like, what, are you sure? So it's like, ideally you're in there, maybe you're getting literally get warm, you do your active leg swing, arm swings, all your basic stuff, or maybe your active warm up is what Chris talked about, the shin box exercise, something like that. And if everything feels good, you've got no history or aches and pains, apprehension, then the barbell is your warm-up. Yeah. Maybe you're changing variables. Maybe you're doing some pauses down there. Maybe you're going, slow tempo with your lighter warm-up sets to get warmer. You know what I mean? Go ahead.
We hit home on this point of doing it with purpose and intent. So you don't want to do your warm-up just willy-nilly and just kind of going through the motions. Your warm-up is a time to do some assessment, right? Like, how am I feeling? And really practicing those motor control, the speed, all those things, that awareness. Do it with purpose and intent. You're prepping yourself for the movement. Your workout is, going to happen. How do you prepare yourself?
I think people don't take enough advantage of their lighter percentages, of their lighter warm-up sets, working up to their heavier working sets as skill work. And especially some, maybe take the bench press. It's got a little bit more nuance, to position. If you're trying to groove your squat a little bit, you use those warm-up sets. Don't just jump 75 pounds, every single time. Go incrementally.
Absolutely. Skill development is a key word that you're using there. Yeah.
I am so glad you brought that up. So we have clients that we work through virtually, and it's not uncommon for us to program multiple sets at 50%, multiple sets at 60%, even when the athlete may be going up to 80 or 85%. They're like, well, why am I doing this? But they don't understand that there's a huge skill component that goes into that training session, into their movement proficiency in the long term. And we know that, maybe not all movement's going to translate or specific techniques between 85% and 50%, but the general motor learning is going to be there. So I think there's a huge value in front loading lighter percentage warm-up sets in all of training.
And doing so may just take out a lot of the warm-up implements and other unloaded drills that they have to do.
Yeah.
Do more of the training.
But Brandon, you let me do 200-pound jumps. I think there's some level that deals with your athlete qualification.
That's like 25-pound jumps for a normal person.
It's the same percentage.
Yeah, exactly. I give you the plan, and then it's like a little kid in the playground. Go. Find me when you're done.
What I found, going back to your question, do you let them go to the bar? Or is there a movement that you would do beforehand? I really like a counterbalance squat, like a goblet squat, as just a general way for somebody to explore their bottom position. We use, I'll say, all right, especially for a weightlifter's overhead squat, they're not comfortable in that position, or a powerlifter who's new, or they're changing their stance, to say, all right, take this plate, take this kettlebell, and experiment with stance. Wide, narrow, toes forward, toes out. Find out where things are comfortable and just hinge naturally. Hang out there, use pauses, use tempo, get warm, and then when they have the barbell on their back, they're able to kind of groove that same pattern.
Yeah, I really like the goblet squat as an assessment. For a new client coming in, we can use it for bracing and for breathing as well, and positioning. It's a good exercise.
We use the goblet squat as the test and retest all the time. I published that several times because that's right. It naturally cues a lot of right things to happen.
Yeah.
And so, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so it takes a lot of that out of there. And that's a great tool. We promote that quite frequently. So. Well,
and I think it creates buy-in too, because a lot of people that come in the door are like, I've got tight this, tight that, or I went to, they went to another coach or a healthcare practitioner, and they told me I had to tight this, I got to, mobilize that. And then, you look at their air squat, you're like, oh yeah, they were right. They squat like a baby giraffe, things are all over the place. But then you put a weight in their hand, and all of a sudden they're like a different human. And I was like, okay, so you actually do have that potential, we just got to work on a little control.
Yeah, you're not having problem achieving depth with this 24-pound kettlebell, so I think the barbell on your back is going to be okay.
Exactly. Isn't that so counterintuitive to think that, like, the lighter the counterbalance, the more difficult it becomes for them to just move their body, and then they have a little external cueing, and all of a sudden, it's there. It's like magic.
Yeah, that's what I love about the goblet squat, is it takes some of that cueing out of there. You get the lat engagement. You immediately cue some of the sternal position, the pressurization. There's a lot of these minute things, especially when you're working with someone new, that just come into place.
Yeah.
So you're a busy clinician, and you're busy with seminars. I was looking at your seminar schedules, like every weekend or every other weekend. And I know that in your practice you come up with ideas and hypotheses and all, but are you planning, or are you doing any research with control groups, any hypotheses that you're trying to prove out right now?
Gosh, you know what? I have relied on people who are much smarter than me to be pumping out the research, and I try to extrapolate that to my athletes. And so I am not, at this particular moment, not involved in a specific controlled research study, but I'll tell you, my face is in every paper I can
So
get.
you're reading the literature.
Oh yeah. The clinical athlete. So when I'm in private practice and I got my niche is barbell athletes, very similar to you guys. And so if they're not a weightlifter, a power lifter, a CrossFitter, strongman, or maybe a football guy, I'm like, I forget. Let me look back. It's like, there's other things in life, and so I've got.
I was one of those.
Yeah. And so I've got this bubble, and then you kind of get stuck in your own biases. And you're writing blogs, which are meaningless, and I'm making these YouTube videos. But then I started this clinical athlete network, and I've got guys working for universities who are researchers and clinicians who have 3 times the experience that I do, and just take me to town on some stuff. And I, over the last year, have really kicked myself in the ass and have gotten back into the literature, so that I can now be confident in speaking these things, and any idea that I have is based on some type of evidence in the science, and it's not just this guruism, that's so rampant now. So yeah, my face, I'm not doing the research. Smarter people do that. My face is just in it daily. It's been great.
So with that, where do you see the movement world going in the next 5 or so years? I mean, we've seen a tremendous change, even from 5, maybe 8 years ago to where we are now in our understanding and application. Where do you see that kind of going in the future? Do you see some of the myths being crushed? Do you see what is your thoughts on that?
To your point of, do I see some of the myths being crushed? I sure hope so. I think what we're going to see, and what I'm going to try to continue to push, is the complex, like going back to the basics. And really, the only things that we know is that, I'm going to go back to progressive loading over time, is what changes structure. From my standpoint, as a rehab professional, it's all about remodeling tissue back to normal state or as close as possible after injury. And at this moment, the only thing that we know of that does that is, first of all, taking out exacerbating factors that would get in the way of Mother Nature, but then reintroducing load consistently over the course of time. Now, what's going to come about, hopefully, is how exactly to implement that load. Because what the research is showing now is that injuries, especially injuries in the weight room, are nothing more than programming errors. So you dosed the exercise. Let's even take out good or bad. There's optimal positions to support load from a physics standpoint, biomechanics, we know that. But there's not necessarily good or bad. There's adapted or unadapted, right? And so if we have a tissue injury, that tissue was not adapted to the dose that you were prescribing. And that's even more important in the rehab setting. So we talked about these jack-off exercises not doing anything, but then you've got these top-tier performance movements that are not necessarily the athlete's ready for, right? And so how do we progress? How do we load? And it sounds super basic, but it's not. And we haven't hit that sweet spot of physiology and loading progressions. So I think what I'm hoping we get back to is, let's take movement patterns: squat, overhead press, deadlift, overhead squat, rotational movements. Let's break down every variation from top end performance, high intensity, high velocity, high load. Break it down to each variant to the next most difficult regression, all the way down to the lowest level PT exercise, and then figure out the response from each. And that's going to be it for each movement pattern. And that's going to be how we truly rehab athletes back. And it's going to create a much more efficient communication line from the rehab professional to the coach, because they're now speaking the same language. The problem now is that the athlete comes back to coach, and coach says, "Oh, what PT do with you?" "Oh, he did some dry needling, he did some ART, he did some E-stim, and he threw a little ultrasound on there, and then he gave me this yellow TheraBand and had me." Most of those things mean nothing to the coach. And now there's no collaboration or integration. And so the coach may throw a regression or an exercise variation that the athlete's tissues were not ready for. It's not that the exercise itself was bad, it was just dosed inappropriately.
Yeah, that's such an interesting concept, I think, is the idea of the actual prescribed dose, whether it's loading, volume being, is it safe to say that that's one of the main determinants in potential injury prevention?
I think it's going to be the biggest. We're seeing it with tendinopathy studies now, and that's something that we can actually objectify, because we know what quote-unquote normal tendon fiber alignment looks like. We know what degenerative fiber alignment looks like. Now there's always the question of, does it even matter, because there's pathological imaging with pain-free athletes all the time, right? So we can do that. That's a whole other discussion. But what we also know is that progressive loading changes fiber alignment. And so I think that's something we can actually objectify and measure over the course of time using different loading parameters, different exercises, different strategies, and track what actually makes changes and what doesn't.
In your opinion, is there any potential for a predictive model to foresee injuries coming from a sense of loading parameters? So say, however we want to quantify loading, is there any potential to actually predict that based on dose in the future and from past data?
I think that we could potentially have a model that will give us some form of foresight. I don't think that prediction will ever be a realistic thing. I think a more appropriate term is reduce risk, reduce relative risk. That we can't prevent anything, we can't predict anything, but we can, based on similar to what you just said, objectify things over the course of several studies, several populations, make hypotheses, and then be able to predict with some accuracy. I think that's going to be part of it. But as long as, and I'm very adamant about not saying that nothing is prevention, because people get hurt. People are going to get hurt. That's just the nature of performance. And predicting is very, very difficult, because what if Adrian Peterson takes a helmet to his kneecap?
Right.
It's just not. So it's that you can't prevent that. But you can reduce relative risk, and I think that's what we're going to get much better at in the next 10 years.
Part of that may be psychological as well. I mean, we tell a lot of the new athletes we get in here to check your ego at the door. I mean, immediately everybody wants to test their 1 rep max. You know, that's the nature of the beast. And so, how do you draw back? How do you get people to stay with the program and progressively increase, as opposed to trying to jump in? Everybody wants to measure how good they are, how strong they are from day one.
It's tough. I think that honesty and consistency with your coaching. Some you're going to lose some athletes. Some are just not going to listen no matter what. But I think as long as you're sending the same message. But I also think that as a coach, having the experience with certain variations, like, give them some success. Okay, maybe you're not 1 rep maxing your back squat, but we use 3 rep max PR'd your front squat or your safety bar squat, or you pulled a deficit for 5 and it was a lot more weight than you had pulled for 5 from regular. Understanding that there are variations, and depending on where you are in a training cycle, you can kind of play with that to give an athlete a taste of success. And I think you get buy-in that way. And if they're able to stick around with you long enough, they start to see, I'm feeling great, and I've been feeling better than I ever have, and I'm getting stronger, and then there's your buy-in there. It's certainly that first barrier when they come in the door, like you said, the checking the ego. But honestly, I think it just comes down to being downright honest and straightforward with them. Like, this is the plan, and this is why we do it. This is where you're gonna be, and this is where potentially you could go if you don't. If you're doing your own thing. Obviously, if they were hurt in the past, what I say as a PT, it's kind of easy for me, because I can just be like, well, you obviously, whatever you were doing wasn't working.
That didn't work.
You're in my office, so let's do it this way. This is why it didn't work, or I'm hypothesizing why it didn't work. This is my hypothesis of why this will work. You've been hurt for the past year, or maybe your PRs have plateaued for the past year. Let's try this. And this is why we think it'll work. And I think if you're just very honest and upfront and very clear about the whys, you'll get buy-in.
Yeah. That's great. Great stuff. I don't know. We're coming close to wrapping up here, Quinn. We're looking forward to seeing you here this weekend.
Excited.
You're going to be at the Kabuki Strength Lab with your weightlifting seminar. But there's so much material to cover. We're going to have you back on sometime in the future.
Please. I love it, guys. I'd be honored.
So, Quinn, before we go today, I know I tried to catch you when I was actually in Orange County. It must have been about a month ago, but you were out of town or what. Do you have a seminar list anywhere, or do you have any resources that people can actually find out more about Quinn and what you're up to?
Yeah, lots of stuff. If you want to see seminars, you can go to clinicalathlete.com/events. Those are more of like my 1-day, more general movements screen. Sometimes we have big conferences that we do. The weightlifting courses that I'm going to be doing at your place the website is cwcseminar.com. And those are lined up. We've got Chicago, Bay Area, Florida, lots of different places lined up for that. If you want to just kind of get in touch with me, find me on Facebook. I think I'm the only Quinn Henoch on Facebook. It's one good thing about having a weird name is that it's easy to find. I've got a couple pages, a coach's page and a personal page. You can message me on any one of those. Instagram is quinn.henoch DPT, and I'm very active there. My YouTube channel, Quinn Henoch, you search that on YouTube and you'll find that. So a lot of the stuff that we talked about, I allude to in a little bit more detail. Most of my blogs are on Juggernaut Training Systems website. You just Google that plus my name, that'll pop up. And I try to answer any and all questions. It may not be within the timeline that you would prefer or the answer that you want, but I will get to everyone. And I'll likely shoot you an email if it requires further discussion. But yeah, social media and those websites would be perfect.
Excellent.
Awesome. Great having you on today, Quinn. Looking forward to seeing you this weekend.
Thanks, guys. Talk soon.
All right. Thanks, Quinn.